Hello, everybody. My name is Rich Norman. I'm here today to bring you the beautiful things. If you've looked at the previous videos, you've seen some relatively immature and reactive material, which, although vital, I'll state right here is the incorrect solution to the problem, although the necessary one. What I'm going to present today is the correct solution to the problem, although it is inappropriate to the situation at hand. By that I mean I approximate 7 years until there is major trouble for humanity. So we have to do something reactive and rapid that is going to stop the situation immediately. However, that reaction is most assuredly not going to change the basis fault within mankind, which is responsible for the full measure of the difficulty. The full measure of the difficulty that I refer to is the lack of any evidence of human evolution since the earliest recorded history of mankind. Well, throughout the course of my life, I've made a study of this, and within myself, and then potentially by extension within mankind itself, I've found what I'm pretty sure is the basis fault that is responsible for the fixation and the lack of evolutionary process. It is evident within mankind. Now, unfortunately, I'm being systematically poisoned by the U.S. government, which is why I'm here today so low in energy and looking so darn grubby. I'm sorry for that. I apologize for my unshaven appearance and exhausted demeanor. But I'm afraid that if I don't convey this information today, I'm going to be even more ill in the future, so I'll be even less able to convey it. And I do at this point still possess enough mental acumen to at least explain the thing. So, human evolution, I'm going to free this for you today, define it, and show you how the human animal could actually be brought to positive fruition and behave in a way other than a warlike, sadistic slash masochistic ever. Okay, the first thing that you need to understand is that humankind is fixated. Now, when I say fixated, what do I mean? I mean that it's stuck at a certain point in its development, and it repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats over and over again, the same error. Now, in all of recorded history, you see this. It never changes. Mankind has failed to adapt or advance ever. There's a reason for this. And that statement probably seems absurd to some of you. Some of you probably think about the obvious technological advancements and advancements in architecture, many different things. But the basic constituency of mankind, the instrument itself, the instrument which is man, is so badly tuned that despite all of the trappings and secondary appearances, we can state without any question at all that no evolution has taken place in the human animal. In pretty much all of recorded history, that's a bit of a fault. Now, first thing I'm going to do then is demonstrate that I'm not lying when I say that, and that that's a sensible statement and not an absurd statement. So I'm going to put up on the screen a super so you can look at a simple fact. The fact that throughout all of recorded history, mankind does one thing. Destroys itself, kills itself, executes itself. It's a fixation. Mankind's own survival is repellent to him. It's the single most ill creature on the planet, man. Look at that list. Mankind does one thing. One thing. It follows insane sadists and destroys itself. It destroys mankind. Mankind rises up against mankind, and in acts of war, acts of sadism, acts of lunacy, it crushes itself. Mankind is always murdering itself, killing itself. And in this we see the basis fixation. Mankind always follows sadistic lunatics and behaves in a masochistic way that leads directly to its own destruction. Over the large quanta of time, a decent chunk, you don't see any period in history that's free from war. People follow sadistic people and they kill their fellow man. That's what they do. So you can see that mankind is absolutely positively fixated and has never advanced. There's a reason for this. and we're going to discuss that. So thank you for tuning in, and I'm going to go ahead and explain to you a few things about fixation, about psychology, about physics, and then we're going to learn exactly what it is to change something like evolution. We'll define evolution. We'll change the evolutionary process itself within mankind here, now. Well, in this video, I'll show you how to do it and explain just what it means. So the first thing I'm going to do is explain all of it. I'm going to define my terms. I'm going to make sure you understand what the heck it is that I'm talking about. I don't want to be one of these people that poses in a giant basket of unintelligible language and pretends that they've explained anything to you. You're going to understand what I'm talking about, and it's going to make sense to you. Okay, I have a bird, I have dogs. You're going to hear squawking, squeaking, barking. Can't be helped, just like my shabby appearance. I'm exhausted, but I do have enough left to get this across to you, so I'm going to tell it to you before it's too late. Mankind has an enormous potential, the most amazing potential, and it's been utterly squandered. Okay, I'm going to talk about that. First question is the question of reality creation. Why does man create the reality he creates? That's called ontology. Why are things brought into existence? Why do they exist the way that they exist? It's an ontological question. So it's an ontological question we're first going to answer. How does man create his reality? There are two different ways in which you can analyze this basic proposition. One is taxonomy, which means the identification of objects. Pretty much all people who are healthy agree, if they're adults and normal intelligence, as to the identity of objects. I'll say that's a rock, you'll say that's a rock, I'll say that's a tree, you say that's a tree. So the taxonomic question is a question of objective identification of objects. That's really not much of a question at all. We all know that. However, if the two of us are sitting side by side and we're both looking at a lake, and I might be a depressed person with a neurosis, and you might be a very healthy person, highly balanced. And we both look at the singular impression of a lake, and we have two entirely different ideas about what this lake is. And you can see how this takes place as a matter of associative dynamics. If you look at the lake and you're a healthy person, you'll say lake, sun, ripples, waves, mother, dress, fluttering, happiness. Just make it up. Now, if you're looking at the lake and you're depressed, I'm depressed terribly. Look at the lake and say, I'm neurotic. I'm going to distribute negative affect on the lake, and you can observe this as an associative chain. I say lake, waves, cold, deep, dark, mother, family, chain, death. Okay, there you go. So you can see that qualitatively, effectively, emotionally, they're two very different propositions. So the effective definition, the qualitative definition of the lake is very different for the two people, even if the objective impression is all but identical. So reality creation is very important. This is the whole thing. This is the hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness develop its quality? Why do objects have particular qualities? This holds everything in this hard problem of consciousness. So as you think about that, you might then next look to the thing which makes that take place. Those associations seem to be mnemic associations, associations that come from memory, from the past of the patient, the past of the individual, and those somehow appear from our associative example to attach directly onto reality to give its qualitative valence. So reality has its qualitative valence established by a static mnemic associative chain. That's obviously clear. However, there's a lot more to it than that. There is unconscious fantasy happening at all times. There's a dream beneath reality happening at all times. If you look at the mental architecture of the brain, you understand that it exists as a series of layers. Initially, there was a full consciousness that was akin to what we now experience in REM, the hallucinatory aspects being a secondary addition. So you can understand that the distant ancestors of mankind had a very effective consciousness that was just like REM dreaming, exactly like it. And you can see this consciousness working to establish effective valence by producing a dream beneath experience. That dream is unconscious. Here's a way that you can kind of get a hint as to the reality of that statement. Imagine, if you will, a lover who is just fallen in love, and he is in that state of fantastic bliss that we feel as we feel exalted and wonderful and highly sexual, highly sexualized. And we distribute that sexual affect onto all of experience. So our imaginary new lover is walking down the same lane he's walked down a million times, but it's completely new if familiar. The trees are voluptuous and fantastic. The leaves are thick and caressed by wondrous wind. Everything reminds him of his beloved. Everything he thinks and feels reminds him of his beloved. And he is thinking about, well, copulating with his beloved, is he not? Everything becomes a symbol of this. Its entire drive suddenly infused into all of reality. All of reality is now rich and voluptuous, thick and wondrous, even if it is taxonomically identical. So here you can see something called sublimation. Sublimation is the secondary application of a drive, to secondary alternate means. So obviously, as he's walking down the lane, he is not actually having sex with his beloved. He is, oh, there's my bird. Isn't that lovely? So he's thinking about everything that he sees, and it is infused with his drives. His drives have infused his visual experience to become thick and voluptuous. Fantastic it is. If you've been in love, you know I tell you the truth. So you can see that one's drives are expressed as a matter of continuous fantasy that is sublimated into your experience of the world. Indeed, you must admit, if you've ever been that lover, that you are always fantasizing about your beloved. And this, we'll call it a preconscious fantasy, because most of the time you're not looking right at it, but you could. This fantasy, this sexual fantasy, is what infuses all of the world with its valence, its wonderfully positive valence. And since it's applied to a secondary aim, as you're not actually copulating, it is by definition a sublimation. So you can see that sublimation of affect gives qualitative valence to the world, as exemplified in the case of our imaginary lover. Now, there is a different dream than this wondrous sexual dream that is going on in the case of our extremely healthy lover. The race of man is fixated. The dream that he has in his unconscious, oh, it's very different than this healthy dream. It is a fixated dream, and it is exemplified by what they call the repetition compulsion. Repetition compulsion is the basis of neurosis, and essentially mankind is neurotic. So we'll talk about that next, and go ahead and explain the way that psychoanalytic practice gets past these problems. Jesus, don't you love my bird? Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the unconscious and how something which is unseen and unconscious could possibly affect visible manifest reality. Well, I'd like to use an analogy to make this intuitively available. You can think of conscious mentation and the conscious representation of the world as being, as we've established, a sublimation that comes from one's drives. Now, this sublimation, therefore, is an internally mediated proposition. It's what's within you which gives the quality to experience. So you can see that it's an internal affective state, which is what gives qualitative valence to all of reality. Analogously, imagine what you're experiencing and the external world, external reality, all of those sort of things is being represented by a magnet on top of a table. And you can think of the unconscious drive as it repeats and does its bit unconsciously in this unconscious dream as being a magnet underneath the surface of the table, which is not visible to see. It's unconscious, you can't see it. However, if that lower magnet is turned, the magnet on top of the table rotates as if by itself. And this is the analogy. So there's an unconscious dream which is providing valence and essentially relational information to define reality, and that's taking place from an unseen location, unconsciously. So that's the problem in curing the neurotic, is finding his unconscious pathogenic elements and making them conscious, because in making things conscious, you change the situation utterly, and this is how psychoanalytic practice gains its efficacy, is by making unconscious things conscious and thereby ending the neurotic situation, which is dependent upon dividing unconscious and conscious. And the way that this is accomplished is within ordinary psychoanalytic practice and therapy through the various structures of the therapeutic situation itself. the various structures of the therapeutic situation itself, bring forth the repetition compulsion from the patient and produce it in a manifest way as a projection upon the therapist. Okay, I'll explain what that means. Just a second, a little drink here. Okay, so the therapeutic situation is structured. So the patient comes into the situation and is told you have certain rules to follow. You have to behave a certain way. You have to follow these rules. You have to analyze everything. You have to associate everything. You have to work everything through, work it all out, and you have to lie in a certain posture on the couch. You don't look at the therapist. There's a whole pile of rules. Okay. So the patient gets pretty good at following the rules and starts to, become good at analyzing their dreams, analyzing their behaviors, and is taught a little bit. But as they get closer and closer to their hidden content in the unconscious, everything in the unconscious that is in the repressed unconscious is repressed there into the repressed unconscious because it is painful for the ego. And as the patient gets closer and closer and closer to this painful unconscious ideation, he starts to break the rules of therapy and repeat some version of the pathogenic impression which is in his unconscious as a transference upon the therapist. This is the repetition compulsion as it is made manifest within therapy, and this is called the transference neurosis. And what we're talking about in this entire lecture essentially is transference theory, because transference, this sublimation that gives things their quality, this is taking place all the time. And here in therapy, we see an artificial example, which is therapeutically efficacious and allows the therapist, who has revealed very little of himself, to analyze the projection upon himself, which is repeating and repeating. Since he's given no information to the patient, it has to necessarily be about the patient. The patient doesn't know the therapist, so the patient is clearly coming from their own internal perceptions and repeating and repeating. So as this unconscious resistance comes to the fore and no longer allows the patient to work through and make profitable work, there we have the efficacious kernel of therapeutic efficacy, because the therapist can analyze this repetition compulsion as it repeats and repeats and repeats as a transference upon the therapist, and thereby derive the unconscious content, making it available to the patient often enough as a construction. He, that is the therapist, reconstructs what has to be in the patient's unconscious and then tells the patient. And then the patient, if they accept that, becomes well pretty quickly. So that's the way that it works, and you can see the repetition compulsion becoming manifest within therapy as an example of the transference neurosis, which is projected upon the therapist, interpreted, permitting the therapist to ascertain the unconscious content within the patient, present that content, make it conscious, and end the neurosis. So the repetition compulsion is the thing which is taking place within mankind. It's a fixation, just like an neurotic patient, and it repeats and repeats and repeats, just like a dream in the unconscious, going round and round and round, providing qualitative valence to experience. Next, you should be aware that the theory that I've presented there, strange as it seems, is necessarily the case. And although there's a lot of debate about this sort of thing in psychology, that debate is foolish and unnecessary, because it's demonstrable truth. All you have to do is lower 5-HT, serotonin, and as repression is 5-HT dependent, the dream then becomes manifest. You can watch the dream. So there's really not any debate about it amongst those who actually know anything about psychology, because they're aware of the fact that repression is 5-HT dependent, and if you lower it, like let's say you have a patient who's on a lot of Prozac, and then you remove them rapidly from that Prozac, you're going to see the delusions that they produce, the hallucinatory psychoses, which result have undistorted unconscious content, undistorted reactive unconscious content. You can see the pathogenic dream without the usual distortions, which protect even a psychotic, and which infuse the dreams of all normal people with twists and turns and distortions, which make it impossible to directly see the unconscious. You always have to interpret a dream to get the unconscious. So these are all defeated. When you lower 5-HT, you can see the actual direct unconscious content. So the dream becomes directly manifest, and what I'm espousing here, it's absolutely true. You can just lower 5-HT and watch. Next, you should be aware that I've developed a technique called native psychoanalysis and a technique within that called the open emotional posture, which permit one to clear away a window of resistance and observe the unconscious dream directly. And within doing that, I've analyzed perhaps 10,000 different examples of these pieces of unconscious content as they spin around and operate in the unconscious to produce neurotic affect and thereby defeat the neurosis. And as you look and understand these various pieces of unconscious content, one thing that becomes completely obvious is this. Unconscious content is always specific. It's always a specific fantasy. It's never a general feeling, oh, I'm just angry. Well, you might think that, but if you were to look in the unconscious, you would see a specific act, a specific piece of violence that was going on down there, lending valence to experience. And as you examine these pieces of unconscious content, they are extremely ugly to look at, and as you look at them, you see it's always scripted from the most ancient acts of violence that the race itself has endured. So you'll always see the ancient rites of the father. If you study ancient history, you'll see that the rites of the father, which used to include exposing a child, castrating a child, killing a child, all these things, these are the penalties. It's always the ancient penalties that are scripting these unconscious fantasies. These negative, pathogenic, unconscious fantasies are always scripted by the past of the race. Now, the past of the race in psychology is referred to as the phylogenetic. So phylogeny, the phylogenetic, the past of the race, exists within each of us. Now, this isn't just some sort of a concept. This has actually been proven that within DNA, epigenetic DNA, what they used to think of as junk DNA, is actually the past of the race. So this is a scripting onto present experience of past learning from the race. So if you take, let's say, a mouse, and you shock it so that it's scared of a cherry blossom, then its offspring will be scared of the cherry blossom. The cherry blossom they see, the offspring, well, it's different than the one that scared the parent. So the current situation is defined and scripted by the past experience of the race, and this goes right through generation after generation. So phylogeny, the past of the race, is actually what sets up and structures unconscious content. And unconscious content, structured thus, gives valence to present experience. So the dream in the unconscious is actually an ancient dream that's using the current props of experience and defining this current experience from that past learning. So here you see the real basis of the repetition compulsion. The past of the race itself is holding the pathology in place as it repeats and repeats and repeats. So if you are to change the fixation, which always has this horrible violence, this horrible masochism, this war and self-destruction, repeating and repeating and repeating, what you have to do is change the unconscious dream. And that means you have to change the relation of the past, of the race, to present experience. You have to change the expression of phylogeny within unconscious processes. The unconscious is a phylogenetically scripted valence distribution network. That's what it is. It's essentially an effective distribution onto current reality. And that is scripted by the past of the race. And this is why the repetition compulsion is so unbelievably difficult to break. It is literally a genetic piece of information, a piece of genetic expression. So you can understand just from that it might be possible to defeat it by replacing one genetic expression that is active with another piece of genetic expression. And indeed, this is how we're going to free the race of man and end the fixation within the unconscious. Because the unconscious of the entire race of man is now infected with this ancient phylogeny. And it is this which is the basis of the repetition compulsion as expressed within the masochism. and the history of mankind. Okay, now I'm going to have to provide you with an example or you will not really understand what I'm talking about. Now, what I'm going to show you is what goes on in the hidden mind of man. You don't see this. I had to develop techniques for years to be able to get to this stuff. So it's going to be unpleasant, but this is what it is. This is what's going on in the fixated dream. Now, when I say that there's pieces of ancient phylogeny which script the penalties and that the objects come from present experience, you must think to yourself, sure, what the hell are you talking about? Okay, I'm talking about this. The ancient penalty of the father. Remember I said it included exposing a child, castrating a child, killing a child, any of those things. Well, castration is just huge in the unconscious. You'd be amazed how much of this you see in there. In female cases, I hypothesize genital mutilation of a similar enough sort takes the place of it in many instances, although certainly not all or the preponderance. Well, that's a hypothesis. One thing that is for sure is that in the case of the male, what you're going to get is castration. And that's definite. So these unconscious penalties that come from the penalties of the father, it's all about patriarchy. The sickness of mankind is about patriarchy. It's about the penalties of the father. It's about the control of the father. Now this goes back to a particular period in the development of man, where what Darwin referred to as primal hordes following around groups of people following around hyperdominant males that were necessitated due to very difficult circumstances. And Freud also believes this idea makes a good bit of sense. So there's a particular period in history where these penalties of patriarchy were so predominant and so prevalent, and they made such an impression upon mankind. And this is the place where the fixation started. So before that, you can see things were not sick in this way, and that period was probably a healthy period. So I refer to these concepts as atavistic evolution. It's a return to a period where the fixation had not yet been set. Now, the fixation presents as a piece of unconscious content with the ancient phylogenetic penalties of the father. Now, those can either be identified with or they can be reacted against. It doesn't matter. You'll see it. And in either case, the amount of energy that's absorbed by the fantasy reduces you to an imbecile. So here, I'll give you an example. I'm the sort of person who loves to think and sit out of doors. I live out of doors. I love to be out of doors. So I'm sitting out of doors. And I'm thinking about some sort of a calculus problem that I'm not able to do. I can't quite figure it out. So then I hear it. Over the horizon come. It's a helicopter. I live in the woods in the middle of nowhere. There are no roads. There's nothing. I like absolute absence of any intrusion. I detest people coming and intruding. And over me it comes. There's the helicopter. It's a sheriff. Looking where he has no business looking. Suddenly I become furious. I'm stupid as a doorknob. I can't think anymore. I can't think about my calculus problem at all. I look at the helicopter passing 100 feet over my head and I'm red and raging. What's wrong? Suddenly I'm an imbecile. So I look into the unconscious and there it is. All my energies are taken up in this pathogenic fantasy. The cop is spread with his legs 10 feet apart, bound to trees, and I'm hacking his groin out with a machete. Hundreds of strokes every second. That is a piece of unconscious content. It's highly specific. It involves the penalties of patriarchy, in this case, castration. And in this case, I'm identifying with the father. Doesn't matter if you identify with the father or you're the victim. The result is the same. All your energy is taken up in repeating this fantasy. And you become enormously stupid. And the entire world has its valence changed to something very, very neurotic and ugly. So you can see a piece of phylogenetic fantasy, and the way that it works is to take the current experience. Note in the example I gave you, the cop, the one presumably flying in the helicopter, is the one represented in the fantasy. But the fantasy itself, that's the ancient penalty of the father. So the fantasy is phylogenetically scripted to present experience. It's unconscious. You don't see it. I only can tell you about it because I use these hard-won techniques to find it. But there it is in all men. The phylogenetic, scripts the unconscious fantasies, and the valence given to experience, there is the history of man. Okay, so to condense, you can see that ontology, that is to say how things gain their quality and sense of existence, is a function of transference, whereby affect is transferred from an unconscious source, a piece of unconscious fantasy, as well as the rapid attachment of static mnemic distributions, in order to provide reality with its qualitative valence, as well as the taxonomic component. So you can see a piece of unconscious fantasy is always giving quality to all of experience, and that this piece of unconscious fantasy may be pathogenic. That is to say, it may cause faulty valence to be imbued into reality, and that is a function of sublimation. So the transference functions from unconscious sources, and those sources are mediated by epigenetic phylogeny. That is epigenetic unconscious theory, and the unconscious is indeed scripted by epigenetic information, and that responds to situations in the environment, the current environment, what they call the ontogenetic environment. And the environment that you are around is constantly triggering epigenetic interactions, and experience is thereby imbued by sublimation with its qualitative valence. So that sounds kind of complicated, but if you think about what we've just talked about, it should be entirely sensible. Think of the unconscious dream taking place like an unseen theater in the mind, and it's spinning away, and it's defining experience, the quality of experience at all times. So that is what we have so far, and you can see the source of the fixation, the repetition, is in the scripting up from the past of the race that's constantly invoked by present experience. And then all things have their valence altered thereby. In this, we see the actual specifics of the repetition compulsion creating the fixation within man. It is this which is responsible for his continuous warlike behavior, his constant aggression, and his constant submission to that aggression. They're all scripted into this perverse piece of epigenetic unconscious fantasy. So, if we're going to change mankind and make it so that his evolution is freed from this fixation and can proceed, what we need to do is to substitute a piece of epigenetic expression which is healthy for the piece of epigenetic expression which comes from patriarchy. Okay, we're getting close to the point where we can start to solve the problem, but not quite. One or two more things, and we'll be there. So first, what we have to do is discuss exactly how it is that patriarchy has its effects, and what it's doing neuroanatomically and psychologically. And then we'll be in a position to talk about some physics and solve the problem. So first off, we have to talk about a couple of buzzwords which are probably going to put you to sleep just to hear them, but actually they're very important. We have to talk about, well, morality and ethics. I know. But I'll be brief about it, and believe me, it is important. Okay. I'm going to make a really sharp distinction and tie it to neuroanatomy. And the distinction comes from philosophy. And the distinction that I'm going to draw is between morality, which I will attribute having a basis in patriarchal penalty, and ethics, which has its basis of operations and dynamism in identifications. So first I'm going to talk about those two rather ethereal and uninteresting sounding ideas that are very important, and then tie them to some neuroanatomy. So, okay, Morality comes as a matter of phylogenetic inculcation into unconscious processes from the penalties of the father. The penalties of the father were internalized into the genes after years of abuse, and likewise, as phylogeny and ontogeny do tend to imitate, within the development of each individual person, there was the introjection of superego, which is, again, the judgment and the penalties of the parents, and particularly the father in the case that we're discussing. Now, these are all pieces of impression that are backed up with penalty. So within you is the penalty of the father from the most ancient times of the race, and then again, as the individual within ontogenetic experience comes to the correct age, the introjects into themselves, person introjects into themselves the impressions of the parents, of the father. So at this point, what you've done is you've brought patriarchy into your internal construct. So you yourself are actually performing the activity that was previously attributed to an external source, the parent. Now, you can see the parallel for this during the history of the Greeks, where the laws actually reflect the weakening of the father's power, and eventually we see within the psyche. If you read E.R. Dodd's works, you can see within the psyche itself is the act of introjection, where an external threat from the father becomes an internalized "thou shalt not" becomes "I will not." You internalize the threat of the father, and you yourself bring about the penalty within your own guilt against the various prohibitions which the father used to be the external mediator of punishment for. So in talking about morality, what we're talking about is a structure where behavior is enforced, modified, shaped, and created based on penalty. Penalty coming initially from the ancient father, then extending to the parents, who inherit the epigenetic payload from history. So that's morality. Morality is a way of controlling behavior which is based in penalty. Okay. Now I'm going to sharply distinguish that from ethics, which are based in identification. Now, identification, we're going to flesh that out after I finish this point. That's where we start to talk about neuroscience. So identification is something that is endemic to all people. All people have associated with them a particular piece of circuitry which was created during the first 18 months of life that has embedded within it identification not only with your fellow man, but with all things in the world. And this is the true basis of empathy, because empathy extends, of course, to your fellow man and to all others like yourself, but it also extends past such narcissistic trivialities to the more important organism, which is all of life and all of the planet and all things and all objects and all which is around you is, in a way, a part of yourself, and identification. Identification is the basis of empathy. So empathy is based on identification. Ethics are founded in empathy. So ethics are an identification-based mediator of behavior. If you identify with another person or with an object or with the tender earth, you're not going to damage that person. You're not going to poke an oil well into the tender earth. You see what I'm saying? So through identification, you have an instantaneous ethical guide which is situationally specific, and it is based not in penalty, but in an extension of one's own self as an act of identification. And we are contrasting that with morality, which, as I said before, is based in penalty that comes from the pathogenic element itself, patriarchy. What is vital to note at this point is that morality has never worked. Throughout all of recorded history, it seems our morality has secured us one thing: masochistic self-destruction, and has placed obedience in place of ethics And as a result, what we have is the history of man. Immorality itself. Killing. War. Destruction of the earth. So what morality has gotten us so far, and it's gotten us nothing else in the entire history of man, is immorality. Morality is a complete and total failure. If you want to improve man, threatening him and dividing his drives into parts that are bad and repressed and obedient and acceptable seems to have created one result: war, masochism, and death. So morality, top-down control of the affects, is a complete and utter failure. In all of human history, it has done one thing and one thing alone. It has secured immorality, masochism, sadism, and death. It's important to think a little bit about how morality has achieved those results. The repressed unconscious itself is created, largely, as a function of guilt. Guilt is distributed by the superego onto the ego, which performs its repressions and at the behest of superego. So guilt is essentially sourced in a death threat, a death wish, since it's been internalized. So guilt is a penalty, a death wish. And this is what creates, to a large extent, the terrible ego dystonic condition, which makes such painful contents out of the repressed unconscious that those drives need to be repressed into it. So what you're doing is you're taking personality and you're fractionalizing it. You're taking pieces of drive and pieces of yourself, and you're repressing them with guilt and placing them into the unconscious. Now, I'm going to propose that the integration of personality is what is going to solve the evolutionary fixation of man, and that means essentially the removal of guilt. Guilt is to be eliminated. The repressed unconscious is thereby to be eliminated, and in this way we can unify all of personality together, and you get an instantaneous identification process with all things, objects, and peoples in the world, which takes the place of moral threat. And what this is going to do is it's going to end the fixation of man by making conscious all of the previously unconscious perverse elements, noting closely that that which is unconscious is eternal and never changes. The way that you cure a neurotic and end the whole problem is to make the unconscious conscious. So that's what you do, is you unify all of the elements which are in the repressed unconscious, and in so doing, you create a dynamic situation which responds by way of identification to all things in the world and develops an instantaneous, endemic, ethical construction, not a moral construction. And in this way, the pleasure principle is no longer in conflict with one's morality, because it feels best to do the right thing once the identifications are in place. So this ends the whole moral conflict with that wretched Kantian philosophy and categorical imperatives, all this rot, by turning them into an actual active proposition that is distributed as an endemic function coming from particular pieces of neuroanatomy. And I'm going to discuss that next. Okay, the next piece that we need to fit into place to understand the basic puzzle and solve it is to understand the neuroscience which is behind superego and guilt. Now, this is concealed in modern neuroscience. It's the single most important question that exists, and there's just nothing available. Who has been doing this research, I think we can guess, and that's scary. Well, I found it myself, and this is it. This is the way that you cure neurosis, and you observe the way social control takes place. Social control takes place through superego, and takes place through these circuits, as mediated through a few other parts. So first off, what we've got to understand is that during the first 18 months of life, the child develops certain fully complete circuit pathways. That is to say, they're not born with them. They're innervated and formed up during this first 18 months. Now, the first of these pathways is a sympathetic circuit called the sympathetic dopaminergically modulated ventral tegmental limbic circuit, as discovered by Schore, S-C-H-O-R-E. Now, this circuit was first formed, innervated through neuroendocrine changes that are initiated through the exchange of gaze and glance between the infant and the mother. Now, during this exchange, you can see the basis of empathy, which is not properly attributed to mirror neurons. This is the basis of empathy. These neuroendocrine changes, which eventually initiate this circuit, are formed through the impression of the mother's face upon the infant, and in a reciprocal exchange of gaze and glance, the child focuses on the mother's face, which becomes its entire world. The entire world, then, for this infant is embodied within the mother's face, which becomes an extension of itself. Differentiation taking place during this period, not before. So you can see this is the basis of empathy in the identification with the entire world, in the impression which forms the neuroendocrine changes, and then the circuit. This circuit is a basis circuit in Panksepp's seeking system, which is involved in explorational activity and seeking in the world. It gives the child the circuitry which is required for dopaminergic expression and thinking is a function of that, of course, and interest in the world, elation, happiness, and an identification with all the world. This is what's formed as this circuit is innervated, and this impression, which starts the innervation process, is the basis of empathy. This indistinct extension of and part of the world. So I hope you can see that as the basis of empathy in the formation of this dopaminergic sympathetic circuit. So as the mother's face and the child's face form a reciprocal exchange of gaze and glance, we see the basis of empathy in this initial impression, which is an unconscious impression later in life. Now that we've established an identification with the world, empathy is formed in the impression, causing neuronal changes that begin the innervation of that sympathetic circuit. You can understand also that that same circuitry underlines Bayes' alpha function, transformative function, which allows you to change impressions, change all sorts of things. Transformation, the basis of healing, is also formed as a function of this circuit, and that is associated with dreaming and the ability to change the dream, which is fixated beneath man. And after that, you should be aware that the circuit which is formed after that, in the latter part of the 18-month initial period, is a noradrenergic circuit which puts the brakes on the seeking activities formed as a function of conditional regard. So if the mother's face is disapproving, then conditional regard is brought into play, and affect regulation is brought into effect through the noradrenergic mediated circuitry, which is a parasympathetic circuit, also a tegmental limbic circuit. So these two circuits both connect the orbitofrontal areas, which are innervated into from the limbic. And the first one is the one which has the impression of empathy itself, a connection to the entire world, which is a responsive part of oneself, identification, the basis of ethics. So now we have the ventral and lateral limbic OFC circuits. sympathetic and parasympathetic working in opposition to each other. And I'm now in a position to tell you basically what happens with guilt and superego. And they create a permanent homeostatic imbalance which curtails dopaminergic distributions. You'll notice that any child that's engaged in these exchanges of gaze and glance is also being touched. So that involves the peptide system, specifically the endorphins. So we can see a sense of security is associated with the basic conditions forming up the circuit, and then a sense of exploration and extroversion and the will to explore the world, the seeking system, panksept, dopamine. All this is then curtailed by the activation of the parasympathetic circuit upon conditional regard. So you can see that the internalization of superego produces a permanent homeostatic imbalance, as conditional regard is essentially never fully forthcoming. Remember your basic psychology in that superego is an extension of the id. Indeed, the amygdala and hippocampal structures could be taken as superego's representative, as associated also with OFC functionality. So when you look at it that way, you can see that inculcating patriarchal penalty has created a permanent homeostatic imbalance within man. That is superego. So man always wants more. Consumerism, you need more and more and more. You fill up this hole that's created through a homeostatic imbalance that is never relenting. There's a reason the Muslim must pray so much. All of one's sins are the thoughts in one's head, and they're known by superego. By the time this homeostatic balance is in place, you are controlled. And you're always in a position where there's not enough dopamine, where you're always in a position where there's not enough endorphins, drug addiction, all the emptiness, the angst within modern man can be laid at the feet of this homeostatic imbalance through which we're controlled. This is the way guilt works. This is the basic aberrance through which morality imposes its division upon the mind of man. The nuclear constituent within man, the very power source of consciousness itself, cortically and the REM system, both, is affect, periaqueductal gray. The affective center is the smallest bit of tissue that can be destroyed that makes consciousness completely vanish. So affect, this is now divided between conscious and unconscious. There you have it. That is the basis for within man. And the repressed unconscious, creating the situation for the continuous unconscious fantasy of a pathogenic quality and the repetition compulsion leading to war. Okay, so we're now in a position to understand the problem and see the basic way that the fixation in man works and is kept in place so as to prevent his evolution. In a word, guilt. So, the removal of guilt, the end of guilt, to lift all guilt. What's that going to do? That is going to remove the pathogenic, repressed unconscious. It's guilt. It's that death threat that created those repressions to start with at the behest of superego. So, to remove guilt is going to produce a different personality type. The first personality type, the pathogenic one, the one that we all are, is essentially summed in a term I'll call sublimation by repression. You think about the topography of what I've described. You have an unconscious, a repressed unconscious, RUCS. This repressed unconscious is invisible, it's spinning away, it's distributing affect into conscious manifest experience. So you have repression, which is sublimated into experience, and those repressions are drives. So drives sublimated into experience under repression. That is sublimation by repression. That's the modern topography, modern man. That's the thing that is keeping us all so very, very ill and stopping all possible evolution because it produces a fixation. The drives are unconscious, so they're always going to repeat, and they're never going to change. They're invisible. On the other hand, what we're looking for, if you were to remove guilt, Then you have the integration of all drives in consciousness. They're not repressed anymore. Now, a drop of salt in the ocean. This is the right balance. So it is with perversions. Once you repress it and you put it into the unconscious, there it becomes eternal, and it grows stronger, and it grows stronger. And you create morality. No. You create immorality for eternity. That's what morality does. Sublimation by repression. Sublimation by integration. All things, to the greatest degree possible, are conscious without guilt and without shame. That way each may do its part. Remember, perversions are component sexual instincts. It is in the uniting of the edifice that health is found. Sublimation by integration. Next, you have to wonder how one is to achieve this new configuration of personality. Remember, we have our pathogenic, epigenetically supported unconscious ideational structure, which is causing the repetition compulsion to just rule the entire of mankind's history. Well, we have decided, if you'll recall, that the best way to take care of this would be to substitute one piece of epigenetic expression, which is not pathogenic, for the pathogenic expression which comes from patriarchy. Now, I believe you might be able to guess which particular piece of healthy expression we should sublimate. Remember the early impression which forms alpha function. Remember the transformative function which allows man to transform and change. Remember the initial impression of empathy, which has built into it ethics to replace the incredibly pathogenic morality. It is this impression which we will substitute in the unconscious to create the correct distributional allocations and heal the neurosis which has fixated mankind. So, I am rested now, and I've come back after a session of DMSA, which has removed a great many of the toxins from my system and permitted at least a partial return of my mental abilities and good attitude. So I'm in better shape today, and I'm ready to continue with the lecture here. So the next thing you have to understand is that we're doing what's known as epigenetic basis unconscious substitution. That means we're taking the epigenetic basis underneath unconscious processes, and we're substituting the pathogenic expression, which is derivative of patriarchy, for a non-pathogenic expression, which is going to be derivative of the initial impressions which yield empathy and the corresponding neuroendocrine changes which formed up the sympathetic limbic OFC circuitry that I had discussed previously. So that series of neuroendocrine changes are set up by a particular impression of mutual exchange of gaze and glance between the infant and the mother. Now, if you'll recall, your basic psychology, you have to interpret dreams. And the entire experience and the idea of the mother is now layered with a great many things well beyond the initial experience. So to get to the initial experience, we will utilize the language of the mind itself, symbolism. You'll recall that epigenetic DNA responds to current environmental stimulus so as to change the valence distributions which are coming from unconscious sources. That means we can change the dream within man by changing the environment in such a way as to alter the epigenetic expression which underlies the distribution of affect onto reality. To put that simply, what we do is we change the impression out here so as to gain a different epigenetic response in there, and that changes the unconscious in terms of its scripting and how it defines reality and experience. The valence is thereby shifted, and you can instate and instill into all of the world a connectivity with yourself, which permits instantaneous, situationally specific ethical adjustments. And the way that we're going to do that is with symbolism. We're going to use the language of the mind. Symbolism, the language of dreams, the language of symbolism. So next I'm going to read something to you, and what this is going to be is a symbolized impression of the initial exchange of gaze and glance between the mother and the infant, which set up the initial neuroendocrine changes and the innervation of the circuitry, the sympathetic circuitry that goes from the limbic to the orbitofrontal areas. So hold on for a moment. I'm going to press the button here and get the lovely piece of symbolized imagery, which is going to call this initial impression that started those changes up. And what that's going to do is bring the basis of empathy forward as a piece of distributional structuralization. That basically will put the transformative capacities associated with alpha function and ethics, that is empathy, in place of the previous pathogenic material. So this is a very simple way that we can take care of the situation externally. I'll discuss its limitations in a bit. But this is what I call the alpha function key. So it's a symbolic key which will change the epigenetic expression and allow you to redistribute and alter the various effective distributions which cause perceptual ontology. Just a moment. The key image which follows will symbolize the alpha function formative impression and provide you with a sense of peace and connection, and permit you to transform libidinal components into a unity with no restrictions. To begin, simply imagine the image and enter into it as if into a dream. This simple meditation, performed for 30 minutes or more, will begin to return to you what cruelty and the past have stolen. This is a symbolism of the events, the reciprocal exchange of gaze and glance which initiated neuroendocrine changes to form the sympathetic limbic OFC circuit in the primary impression of empathy. Please relax, hear the water, and listen to my voice. There is a meadow within the forest, surrounded by trees stirring a distant breeze. The day is still and quiet. Listen to the shining brook spilling itself over smooth rock and sand. Listen as it splashes so near the meadow. You are dreaming in the meadow, reclining in a still bed of folded grass and thick green moss. The day is sweet and warm. The breeze is a caress. The sound of bird song and clear silver water, laughing and trickling, wrap themselves around you and enfold you. The wooded valley holds you in the cup of tender morning light, spilling her heart of golden warmth upon you. The sun is pouring down upon your face, shining and warm, golden and loving is this light, a light you are folded into and have created, shining, pouring back up into the arch of heaven, spilling up from your glad face, and again down to fill you. The trees nodding as you dream them, the sky golden and warm as you have poured it, and back around, for it has dreamt you. Now is the world, of the world, nourished and warmed, the circle complete, a round of golden warmth and light, spilling into the world and returning again unto you, and again you unto it. And all the world is eternal, safe, nourished and nourishing, a circle of happiness, pouring down and returning, warm and sweet, the circle glowing, life spilled round into warmth and golden light. So, that simple image will do a lot to change the transference structure itself by way of resonance. The actual impression is now unconscious, so what you need to do is to draw it up to the surface, analogous to a construction. But you use symbolism, so I've symbolized the exchange of gaze and glance in the sun pouring down. That's the mother, and then back up from you. It's reciprocal, it goes round, and the dream, you've dreamt the trees, they've dreamt you, it's dreamt you, you've dreamt it. There's the connection. The symbolism is that of empathy and that of connection. So this symbolism of the initial neuroendocrine changes that were initiated by an impression. The impression is what this symbolizes, and that's also associated with endorphins. Remember, touch is also involved. So the feeling of security is absolutely requisite to be able to think and to feel and to explore in the world. This is the seeking circuitry that is in part being innervated here. And so it's a feeling of connection and security, which is the requisite basis upon which we explore into the world. And that world is something to which we are connected. And in this way, there is an inherent ethical basis in all behavior, and really rules are not required. Some sort of external validation is most assuredly not required. You can see how superego in its current configuration is essentially, well, it's there to create obedience. And by creating obedience, it uses threat. And since it uses threat, it displaces the initial basis of security, the connection to the mother, the entitlement to the mother, think of the Oedipal situation, etc. So in removing this basis of security, conditional regard becomes primary, because only conditional regard, only being obedient and getting the approval of some sort of authority is going to restore the circuit balance and give you rights, again, however briefly, to the correct homeostatic basis upon which thought, empathy, and essentially the evolution of man is based. Now, observe what we've done. We've taken the transformative circuitry, alpha function circuitry, the circuitry which is responsible for transformation of dreams. And there's a dream going on all the time in your unconscious, as we have established. So this dream is the fixation. Its unchanging nature is the fixation. So we have substituted at this point the transformative capacity itself for that fixation, and that is dependent upon the matriarchal relations of nurturance and so on. So we bring this impression to the fore, and the transformative capacities along with it. Now here you have human evolution. So human evolution is the ability to transform the dream, to change. So next I'm going to discuss a little more about evolution in general, a bit about math, and then a bit about physics, and then we can sort of tie this together with a few other more interesting and ethereal ideas, and come up with an actual practical application of evolutionary process as applied to the reconfigured mind here on this video between the audience and myself, so as to demonstrate the actual specific feasibility of these concepts in terms of their application and so forth. So, okay, I'm going to go have a drink of water and a half cup of coffee and see what that does. Come right back. Next, I'm going to talk about what probably seems to be an unlikely topic, but it's highly relevant. I'm going to talk about a tiny little worm, C. elegans worm. Now, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that exactly right, but that's the deal. E-L-E-G-A-N-S, C-that. So there you go. This tiny worm, around 300 neuronal mass. It's around, it's everywhere. There it is. Now, there's a little teeny microscopic worm. It's been analyzed by a fellow named Elio Conte and myself and a team of other guys. And what we found about this worm is really very important, and I'll tell you why. During the Cambrian period, a sudden explosion of evolutionary development took place. Now, this is associated directly with 300 neuronal mass. So at 300 neuronal mass, it seems that some sort of a self-recursive feedback loop takes place so as to supplement basic Darwinian processes. Now, this is a teleological element, an element in which the system, through self-recursive feedback, actually defines its own outcomes so as to produce the manifest proliferation of evolutionary result. So, what that means is that at 300 neuronal mass, something very important takes place. We see evolution really take off. It's as if there's a teleological component, a component where intention plays a part in the outcome of the physical system, of the biological system. So, Penrose and Hameroff, or I should say Hameroff and Penrose, if you look at the order on the paper, have basically figured this thing out, and they've got a bunch of math for it. It's quantum. And they say at around a minute, the thing has a conscious quantum of around a minute. It actually has sort of a self-consciousness, a self-perception that takes place at a minute, and through this feedback into its own self at 300 neuronal mass, it is able to direct its own system state outcome and cause evolutionary processes to take place that are very specific and work most advantageously, resulting in an explanation for the Cambrian explosion as it's known. So, What you got to see when you look at that is that this is the basis of what's going on with human evolution in terms of its physics. There's kind of a Lamarckian element to it, a piece of intention which shapes design, if you will, into outcome. So if you look at this small worm, you see a couple of things that are interesting. First off, you see that many of its behaviors that take place, it bends, it has trunchial bends, it has flexures, it has all these rudimentary behaviors, and they all occur more quickly than the conscious quantum of a minute. So they're all unconscious. They happen in a shorter period of time than the conscious quantum. So these are reflex behaviors. They're somatic behaviors. By somatic, I mean they involve the body of the worm. The worm is either moving towards something it requires or away from an impingement upon its environment, upon its person, its body. So it has to respond, move away from it. So these reflex, somatic behaviors appear to be the basis of the evolutionary adaptivity to the environment that the worm lives in. So we can see that evolutionary processes at the fundamental initial inception appear to be based on unconscious, somatic wishes that are just motor response. We will call those motor wish. Motor wish is the basis of teleology. So the next thing that you need to understand is that when Elliot and I analyzed the worm, the entire connectomics of the worm turned out to be multifractal. A multifractal is very interesting. It's a fractal of a fractal, and it has evolving singularities. The singularities change. That means over time, it adapts. Every piece of the connectomics of that worm was multifractal. So, we now know motor wish is at the bottom of teleological evolutionary process. So, that's interesting. And the reason that's interesting is because at our level, at the unconscious level, analogously, we see the same thing. We see essentially motor wish. And if you look at those unconscious processes, they resemble quantum processes. That is to say, there's no distance. It's like a higher dimensional space in that things are connected. It has many, many degrees of freedom. The temporal aspects are completely nonlinear. Temporally, things go in every different which way, every different order. Cathexes, that is to say energy and information, can be transferred instantly between any different object or complex of objects. The entire of the unconscious appears a quantum. So you can see also, as you look at the experiments, such as those of Dean Radin, and I've written Dean, and he's written me back, and I can ascertain with certainty and tell you with certainty that the experiments which he's done demonstrate exactly this. Motor wish, unconscious motor wish. That's my interpretation. What he told me is that you can sum the participation of various people all around the world, and they can affect the physics of a quantum experiment, a quantum double slit experiment, which becomes, in its laser output, more particle-like. That's the way it's put. So you can affect physical systems with thought. Here's a piece of teleology, as we have been discussing, and indeed it does work as a piece of unconscious wishful expression, and it can be summed over many different participants. You have many people involved in one of these bits of motor wish on the object, then the response is greater. So you can see the future of mankind is involved in the cooperative distribution of positive affect, and in this way, we can actually affect the evolution of the species and so forth, the evolution of the future of mankind and so forth. Now, if you know something about the modern theories of time in physics, entangled evolution is what they're saying causes time as we perceive time. It's a measure of change. So what we're affecting is the entangled evolution of the system, the way that time unfolds. So we can think of this under a term, I'll call it temporal mass. You have more and more mass, and then time unfolds differently. Temporal mass, the evolution of the system, the temporal evolution, the entangled evolution of the system is varied in a very, very minute degree, a very small degree, but a demonstrable and experimentally demonstrable degree by thought's effect upon physical and hence biological systems. So here we are thinking, and it's a motor wish. So you're thinking about the object, the double slit experiment or whatever it is, and you are imagining that you are one with it. So you can see how nicely that fits with the basis of empathy, which has you essentially connected as a matter of identification with all things. So it's the empathetic wish. It's the connective, collective wish amongst humankind, amongst humans. It's an unconscious wish. It's a somatic impression. So you can see as it's going to bring about the change in human evolution, the reactivation of the dynamism of human evolution. So as we've had an unconscious that has been fixated and its wishes have been extremely negative, we have received a negative fate, and it has never been any different. War, 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 war. Morality assures that as we suppress, repress our various aggressions, they become eternal and omnipotent. So instead of this, we will substitute this other piece of epigenetic unconscious basis expression, and in this model, we're going to now have different wishes. We're going to have wishes instead of to be obedient or to respond to the threats of patriarchy. We're going to have wishes where we wish to be united with the life force and to change and to alter its proliferation so as to increase it. So as to remove compartmentalizations and disconnections, we're going to follow the theories of Tononi, take integration, and we're going to integrate information rather than separate it and compartmentalize it and split apart its nuclear elements into various separated portions. We'll do the exact opposite. We will alter and change things by making the transformative circuitry primary and change the unconscious to reflect essentially nurturance and carrying an entirely different motor wish. The motor wish associated with transformation, with change, with the nurturance and the potential of mankind, which is really an empathetic wish, a wish that's based in the connection with the earth, with the mother, with all of these things. It's a matriarchal wish. This is the soil from which evolution springs, not threat. I had neglected to mention and wish to correct the omission that superposition is extremely important in terms of its relation to unconscious processes. This basis of quantum theory itself is reflected in unconscious processes. That is to say, compromise formation symbolism is the norm. That's what you get in dreams, is compromise formation symbolism and superposition. Distance, time, all these things are quantum. And superposition is what's represented in unconscious processes, compromise, formation, symbolism. So when you talk about what's conscious, you talk about or. It's this or that. The logical exclusivity is the hallmark of manifest conscious thinking in our species at its time. But if you look at the unconscious distributional process by which effective valence is imbued into experience, you will see something more primitive. You will see superposition. Everything is compounded together in terms of compromise formation symbols. That's the unconscious process. Is essentially superposition with all of the temporal characteristics and connectivity of distance and instantaneous communication of energies and things across the entire of the structure. So the entire of the unconscious is essentially what is modeled mathematically in quantum theory. Quantum theory is the mathematical articulation of unconscious processes themselves. Well, lastly, what I'm going to do is essentially form a temporal mass generator with you and produce a piece of human evolution. So that's going to be a bit of fun. But before I do that, before we do that, I should say a lot more accurately. You should understand this, the actual evolutionary change which I'm talking about, which will free the evolutionary process in man and allow our race to do something other than kill itself, will actually take a few generations at the very best, at the most hopeful. You see, to remove the repressed unconscious proper and create an integrated personality, sublimation by integration, is going to have to involve the rearing of children. We've already been raised in such a way as to present us with an all but insurmountable obstacle to take a modern man, a modern woman, and turn them into somebody with an integrated personality would require, well, if you want to go with the traditional Eastern method, where you essentially take all the affect out of experience and kind of unite yourself with it at the same time, well, that takes a lifetime. And then again, if you were to use my methods, you essentially have to rupture personality and destroy superego. You literally have to kill this thing to remove guilt. What's necessary is to create a personality that doesn't have any guilt. And then the repressions vanish, and at first, if it's a modern, boy, is that a tremendous and powerful piece of pathology that you discover in the unconscious, which is exposed at that time. And you have to just take superego and expose it to each piece of vile unconscious content, and eventually you can destroy the thing and reintegrate your personality. But it's very painful. So a modern, it's very difficult to create sublimation by integration. It can be created in pieces and parts, and we can approach it, certainly, without question. The book that I have linked tells you exactly how to do it. However, the real hope is for the next generation and those even subsequent to that. Those people can be raised in such a way as not to produce a repressed unconscious and who would never trigger the epigenetic impressions which substantiate patriarchally poisoned transference. So to create this integrated personality will require several generations. Now, you can achieve a lot of it yourself here and now. You can actually achieve the entire thing, but you have to all but destroy your personality as it exists now. And now if you read my work, you can see the techniques are specified. You can see how to do it, but it's very painful, and I don't really advise it. A partial invigoration of the more healthy way of being is what I advise for you, and that involves these meditative exercises and so forth. Now, I'm going to also include a second link with a bit more depth psychology in it for those who are interested in making more changes, or perhaps you're a bit more ill and you want to do something about that yourself. All of my work teaches you how to cure yourself. No therapist, please. You're the therapist. So that's what you get with my work. Now, to understand that is to understand the necessity of bringing about an immediate change in terms of the poisonous application of geoengineering agents. That has to be done right now. The beautiful change which I'm advocating here and which we're about to partake in is going to be too slow and too slight to take care of the immediate threat posed by geoengineering. So I want to be clear on that, and to let you know that there are limitations to what I've just explained. In terms of altering the topography of a modern mind, it can only be partially with the techniques and the small things that I have articulated here. It will take generations to achieve this thing, and the actual removal of the repressed unconscious, that is to say, the removal of guilt. So in this way, we remove guilt, we unite all things. Now, we can do that partially now with that alpha function image. So take that, have that as a background image in your thought at all times. At all times, always have that wonderful, beautiful image running. You may wish to take the image and pair it with a piece of music. If you over and over again picture the image and over again hear the music by a process called heavy and learning, you will create a situation where all you'll have to do is think of the song, and the image will come to mind. That image will then function to bring up the initial impression from long ago of nurturance, which is the basis of empathy. By having the basis of empathy as the main mediator of the transference, we are in a position to have ethics inculcated in everything we do, and to become healthy and to free human evolution, because we have the transformative capacities brought to the fore, as well as the empathetic capacities. There's an ethical basis in mankind. This is the atavistic evolution that I've been talking about. So you should now understand the limitations and understand the amount of time it will take to actually produce this change within humankind. And now that I have said that and put those caveats in place, I'm going to go ahead and have another half a cup of coffee and come back, and we will participate in an experiment right now and begin the dynamism of human evolution and end the fixation here and now with a demonstrated example of the production of temporal mass spread across various participants, me and you. Okay, now we're at the beautiful part. This is the fun part. All right, here's the deal. Think, if you will, for a moment of the Nietzschean concept of the will to power. Okay, Nietzsche was brilliant. If you ever read Nietzsche, and you have to read all of it to get it, If you ever read Nietzsche, boy, you'll have found a best friend. That guy is really insightful. Well, Nietzsche's idea of will to power, a very, very intelligent idea. This idea is normally conceived of in a certain way. Imagine one cell, it wants to become more powerful. It wants to grow, so it consumes another cell. It's bigger. Once it's consumed a cell, it's more powerful and it's larger. Will to power. What if we were to apply the idea of will to power, but at a higher level? Instead of something consuming something and dominating it, how about if we take the system itself and connect it all together? At that point, we have developed a very large mass. And this, as you know, is going to produce the greatest possible effect on probability outcomes and the greatest possible effect on evolutionary processes. So, if we can unite a great many people, as the physics informs, under the somatic wish, the kind wish, the wish that's based in a bodily sensation, a wish for love and connection, then we can form essentially a will to power, which will be not really a will as usually conceived of as coming and emerging from some sort of sadistic dominance, but the will be an emergent property of the system itself. That is the higher adaptation of the notion of the will to power. The will to connection. This will achieve the greatest possible mass. So, I'm going to read you a bit from a physics paper that I have written with a man named Arvidas Tamoulis. He's a brilliant scientist. And you can hear this in the language of science. And then we will perform a working experiment, a working example. We will create temporal mass and bring the evolution of man into an immediate fruition here and now as an experiment performed between all those who are participating. Just a moment. The storm approaches. You'll hear it coming through my cloth roof. And I've decided I'm not going to put the cover over the bird and make it suffer for a smooth recording. I'm just going to read this to you. And you'll understand first in the language of science, and then as an actual image that we can all share and understand how it works to change the probability outcomes, which our race is capable of generating. We will form a temporal mass generator between you, I, and anybody who is watching and participates in this. Allow this vision to take hold, and we can begin to actually place a real basis beneath the active reinvigoration of the evolutionary prospect that man has, because man's potential is it's all but infinite. It has been curtailed and squandered. Right now, let us resuscitate this thing and participate in a piece of atavistic evolution. From the conclusion of quantum entangled prebiotic evolutionary process analysis is integrated information from the origins of life to the phenomenon of consciousness. Norman and Tamoulis, Journal of Computational and Theoretical Nanoscience. What is the lesson of quantum prebiotic evolution? What is the lesson of integrated information theory? The lesson is quantum. Informational division, competition and dominance, secrecy, covert behaviors of governments, and the urge for hidden competitive advantage are poison. Anti-consciousness. The lesson of life is the quantum lesson. More consciousness, more integrated information, more unity. It is vital to understand the historical and psychological genesis of the problem, and that there is a solution most easily applied to the next generations of a more difficult road for ourselves. The basic structure of modern mental topography, the system based on shame and repression, on informational division and compartmentalization, can be exchanged for one based on integration, empathy, and ethics. The quantum human paradigm. Competition, division, and monetary valuation. These bits of madness are the falsehood of man. Ours is a race of connection and unity, or is itself a bit of sickness and disease. Entanglement and positive affect can be seen to affect probability outcomes themselves. Sadistic dominance and threat are cancer. Cooperation and unity, entanglement and positive affect are our lucky future. Ethics, demonstrated by way of experiment. The actual quantum process forms are the answer. Within the fabric of physics itself are embedded ethical structures. These are quite independent of any external threat or validation, and are simple systemic component structures in their interrelations. The nonlinear paradigm, both ontological and physical, is based on entanglement. Entire groups of informational and physical processes become entangled and operate as one unit. These efficient organizational dynamics are the fount of life on Earth, and are a constant force from which the result we see emerges. Cooperative ontological dynamics are built upon trust. The systemic basis of operations is empathetic in structure, meaning it is based on identification simultaneous with individuation. This stands in stark contrast to authoritarian structure, the will created through systemic immersion rather than overarching sadistic derivatives. Such effects are increased with individual participatory compounding. Each one who contributes to the singular goal creates a greater overall effect. Psychology and physics are themselves the very marrow of the shabby word spirit. The future of man is not a ghost, a guess, or a judge. The future of man is that which he wishes to become. Please join us and meditate upon the following image. Let us create temporal mass as a unity and summon a new world. A nexus is a means of connection, a link. We will become a temporal mass generator. This is the nexus thought. We are within the tender meadow. Delicate winded ripples play among the tips of new meadow grass, and as a whisper, the sun splashes upon the silver brook beneath us. Hints of blossom speckle gentle breeze, and all the world is cupped within each ripple of breath. Enfolded intricacies whisper, shifting as delicate hands weaving light and shadow. A dappled brook splashes up amongst the shadows. Within the palm of time, we are sheltered, so beautiful to you, as a liquid jewel, pure and perfect, running in silver, painting the rounded stones with silver cool, your clear skin of light as a stream running over cool stone, laughing. Look and see the river of time, silver and slipping, cool and light. Bubbles speak and retreat amongst the cool shadowed noon of our beginning. Each twig is bathed in light, cracked ice solved in yellow gold. Leaves of fall tugged loose to paint time's tender curtain in crimson and gold. So beautiful to you, so sweet and warm is this evening, cool upon the heat of day. Each second pours ever richer, ever thicker with light, as melt glass flows, stretching it warm within each shadow and leaf, golden and round, clear and full. Look out and behold. Each aged maple's lofty crown stirred by an unseen wind, each slipping stream of bright rippled mirror, each shifting wave of tasseled meadow grass, the sweet earth under the melting heart of her yellow noon, the first nook of heaven as she tastes the rouge of dawn, the sheltered sky over each flourishing bounty bestowed and nurtured beneath, each creature basking beneath the arching warmth of a golden sun, stretches, languishes before you, warm and full, grateful, waiting. Each moment opens itself so you may sweetly fill it with gratitude and warmth. Each living thing is within you, bathed in warmth beneath a purring sun, The world fills you, warm within your beating breast, enfolded and enfolding life. It is a thought of gratitude which will change the destiny of mankind. Thank you for listening.